Hello, you're listening to PSGR NZ. My name's Jodie Brunning and I'm speaking on behalf of the Physicians and Scientists for Global Responsibility, New Zealand. And it's 2023 and we're talking about the New Zealand EPA, our Environmental Protection Authority, and we're looking at the evidence for spraying of herbicides in urban areas in New Zealand. And we're talking about that because after 30 plus years, where is the NZ EPA's data providing evidence for safety? Today we'll be talking about regulatory decisions relating to glyphosate and metsulfuron methyl. Now, both of these herbicides are commonly sprayed and they're often mixed together in a tank mix to increase the ways that they will kill weeds and prevent what's called herbicide resistance. We're going to look at European approaches for regulating and approving these chemicals versus the New Zealand EPA. And we're going to talk about how councils in New Zealand are often faced with information that's often contradictory and difficult because they're trying to balance priorities, but they often defer to the New Zealand EPA, and that can be quite problematic when you look at the evidence and the science. So, and we're also going to look at how can councillors manage that. First of all, I'd like you to have a quick look at some images in the Bay of Plenty region. Now, the New Zealand EPA state that glyphosate, if used according to controls and regulations, is safe and highly beneficial. And in a recent 2022 summary from a call for information, they stated that glyphosate helps manage resistance. Now, they were stating this because they were repeating perhaps 20 or 30 submissions from orchardists and growers that seem to say the same thing, helps manage resistance. But what we can see along the roadsides is definite resistance from gorse and agapanthus, blackberry, bracken and heather. So we can see that there is a problem with herbicide resistance in New Zealand. And globally, if you take a look at this graph from the International Herbicide Resistant Weed Database by Ian Heap, you can see that glyphosate now has at over 50 species that are tolerant to the herbicide, and we can see that metsulfuron methyl getting on to 170, 175 different weeds that are resistant to the group that metsulfuron methyl is part of. So this is a fight against herbicide resistance. Now, I want to be quite clear here. Chemicals in the environment are a distinct problem. In fact, what we can call them, we can group them into what's called novel entities. And novel entities include chemicals and they include biotechnologies. And scientists Lynn Persson and colleagues at the Stockholm Institute recently stated that they believe that the safe operating space of the planetary boundary for novel entities has been exceeded since annual production and releases are increasing at a pace that outstrips the global capacity for assessment and monitoring. And we can also see that production of chemicals has increased 50-fold since 1950, projected to triple again from 2010 to 2050. And we can see that of the 350,000 chemicals on the market, only some 20% have been registered. Now, New Zealand will pretty much have registered chemicals. That's we've got a fairly good registration process. We know that chemicals are approved for release onto the market and spraying into the environment. Recently, in the New Zealand EPA 2022 annual report, the EPA said, because we ground our activities in evidence and risk assessment, but if you look at the New Zealand EPA, what they're actually doing, formal risk assessment is declining. In fact, if you look at this little chart here for 2021 and 2022, there was no assessment. There was a ground for reassessment, that was glyphosate, but there were only amendments, what's also known as reauthorizations. And reauthorizations or amendments are basically what happens when the chemical company usually want to increase the use for their pesticide, but sometimes it can be reducing the use after perhaps decisions have been taken overseas that mean that obviously it shouldn't be in the New Zealand environment or managed in a different way. But we can see that by really doing risk assessment and amending them, it's muddy as to sort of what is upholding herbicides and pesticides that are being sprayed in New Zealand. What science is upholding that? It's very difficult to see on the website. So there's barriers to the public to understanding what science provides a rationale for the sprays that people may be exposed to from neighbouring farms, orchards, or along roadsides and in public places. And we can see that, reassessment, let's be clear, by convention is based on applicant data. Now, if you looked at the US EPA or European Food Safety Authority, what tends to happen is that the authority will release their information, and then the public will submit to that, whether that content is good or not. But what we're tending to see here is a constructed process called a call for information that happens before the risk assessment. So this process started following the development or the release of a risk assessment methodology for hazardous substances. It's instructions for applicants and officials to show how they do this work. But in this risk assessment methodology, there were no instructions for officials to take a precautionary approach, for example, if there's uncertainty. And it put in the terms calls for information could be used to assess. Now, we don't need calls for information to decide whether a product should be reassessed or not. The manager of the EPA, the chief executive, can call for an assessment. So the EPA can simply have scientists that turn around and say there's significant new information. Chief executive, what do you think? The chief executives can say, yes, I think there should be a call for information. And then a committee convenes to decide. Now, what we're seeing here instead is a call for information, and the summary of the call for information that we've just seen with glyphosate was a he said, she said, and it didn't analyse the science or the epidemiology studies that were supplied. It was more a he said, she said, as I've just said. And what we're seeing is by the NZ EPA is the downplaying of the epidemiological research. Professor Neil Pearce has recently, in this book, Pesticides and Public Health, talked at length about that. We doubt that New Zealand EPA has an epidemiologist or a section that could actually talk about human health exposures. Rather, the EPA focuses on toxicological models, which is more looking at a specific active ingredient and specific ways that will harm, for example, a rodent, or what the modelling will state. Is it likely to harm? How will this work? What the NZ EPA also do is when there's data gaps, they do not contract science to fill those data gaps. And that tends to be a problem with regulators all over the world. But what we also see is a failure to develop policy as the science improves and the knowledge on risk improves. So my background research is on the policy and science and the difficulty scientists face in sourcing funding for endocrine disrupting research into environmental chemicals. And what we see is there's no policy on endocrine disruptors, with the New Zealand EPA, despite the fact that many chemicals become known as endocrine disruptors. But one of the biggest issues, I believe, is that despite the Has No Act requiring that officials use a precautionary approach and take uncertainty into account, there's no instructions or assistance in this brand new methodology on how to do this. Now, Andrea Tomanici released a paper in 2020 that was quite clear. Our carcinogenicity classifications are much less stringent than Europe or the US EPA. So we're weaker. We've got more chemicals that are declared carcinogens that might not, in New Zealand, that are not considered to be cause cancer. Our groundwater protections are clearly weaker than Europe. once European scientists consider that there is a groundwater issue, that use of the herbicide or pesticide will be severely curtailed to prevent the distribution of the herbicide or pesticide into groundwater. And what the New Zealand EPA also does is it approves higher concentrations of substances such as methylfuran-methyl or glyphosate than Europe. So applicators can buy 600 grams per litre, so high concentration of the active ingredient. Yes, they're still required to spray it at the same, reasonably similar levels as Europe, but you get the greater risk of greater exposures to applicators from accidents, which are actually common, and you also get the greater risk of a more toxic, a higher exposure as if the tank mix isn't mixed absolutely accurately. Let's be clear, for metsulfuron-methyl, which is widely sprayed down roadsides, I'm less clear on whether it's mixed into tank mixers and used in urban environments, but it's never been had a risk assessment undertaken. It's been available. It was added since at least 2006, if not before, but there's no individual approval. So it's not on the applications register. It's not an approved substance with controls from what I understand, other than the aquatic controls, which is under a group standard. And if you look at the science that the EPA have on their website, they say it's very toxic. The aquatic toxicity is a big problem. You look at the years from this that the science is based on, it's 1988, 2000 and 1997. What you see is a habit of the EPA to not update the science, not look at the literature, because of course they're relying on industry data. And so the industry will supply the data proving safety based on the requirements in the EPA protocols, but often they will use very old data, and so we don't see updated based on newer evidence, such as looking, for example, at neurodevelopmental risk or anything like that. New Zealand has done, as I said, a modified reassessment in 2012 to extend the use of metsulfuron-methyl onto aquatic surfaces. At about that same time in Europe, they were pulling back the applications of metsulfuron-methyl because of the concern the herbicide and the metabolites to move into groundwater. And please note that in New Zealand, the ESR, which monitors groundwater, from what I understand, doesn't monitor metsulfuron-methyl, even though it's widely used in forestry and along roadsides and in agriculture in New Zealand. So we have no idea whether it's in groundwater in New Zealand. So instead, we see in Europe, in contrast, that in 2010 they were stating that people must pay attention to the protection of groundwater, particularly aquatic organisms. And in 2015, in the conclusion on the pesticide peer review for metsulfuron-methyl, they stated that it should be a candidate for substitution because, among many reasons, metsulfuron-methyl was not readily biodegradable, with a half-life between 50 and 579 days, and because of the groundwater gaps and the genotoxic metabolite triazine amine. So this not readily biodegradable issue means that if this is being sprayed on roadsides in New Zealand, where children and pets travel, where birds travel through, what we'll see is that once the herbicide has dried, the active ingredient still carries the same toxicity. So there is still the potential for exposure. So, we need to be clear that there's no 24-hour window or 48 hours when it's then safe to walk on. And that seems to be a problem with New Zealand believing that it's safe then. And of course, New Zealand also say once the label says it's safe, but of course the label doesn't look at exposures in roadsides and in public spaces. So it's quite a different risk scenario that's not being addressed. And we can see that oral absorption is 80% in 96 hours. So there's quite a lot. If you were being poisoned by it that would stay in, for example, your gastrointestinal tract based on rat studies. Also, the problem in Europe was that they considered that there were too many impurities in the substance, and so this did not relate to the toxicological reference values. There was a massive groundwater data gap for this metabolite that could be genotoxic. It's triazine-amine, INA4098. And then we see the caution in Europe. Europe limits sprays to sprays in spring and winter because of the problem of persistence in groundwater. You can't spray a lot, you can't spray repeatedly. And so European, the conclusion tells us that also that metsulfuron methyl and the metabolites are highly mobile. So that triazine metal metabolite will likely end up in groundwater. And interestingly, if you look at the information to protect non-target terrestrial plants, 20-metre no spray buffer zone. So when you're spraying metsulfuron methyl along roadsides, there is no such thing in New Zealand. You can see that the current permission holders are big industries and big organisations. Forestry is a massive user, but of course there's no scientific research community with block funding independently and outside these groups that is able to say, hey, the science on risk is pretty bad. For example, your use throughout forestry and national parks might be impacting our groundwater. And this is made worse because there's no groundwater monitoring by the ESR. So then we also know from history that they won't be looking at complex groundwater and complex ecosystem interactions. For example, what are the pressures from the other herbicides that will be mixed in with metsulfuron methyl, including, for example, any adjuvants. And so as a result, when this call for information comes about, what we'll see a lot of science coming in from these big industries. A lot of that science will reflect the old regulatory studies, because what you see is the New Zealand EPA and most of the regulators holding on to the traditional basic toxicological parameters, but they're not including, for example, neurodevelopmental toxicity. They're not looking at endocrine disruption to vertebrates or really prioritizing that and understanding what happens if there's a mixture effect. So, and we know that the industry suppliers aren't going to talk about the absence of data or the data gaps. So this is a quick look at, this has just been released. You can prepare an application for the call for information. Their aim of that is to prepare an application for reassessment. As I said, they do not need to do a call for information, don't need to go through a whole year or two of preparing the call for information, getting all the information in, and then producing a summary report that doesn't even look at the scientific evidence. That is just a he said, she said, here are the activists, here is the industry. We're just being impartial here. That's not the EPA's job. The EPA's job is to protect health and the environment. So if you look at on the call for information, the scientific and technical information, you can see they're clearly not asking for epidemiological public health information. And we can see from how they reported on the glyphosate call for information that this is a he said, she said process. And I wish it wasn't, but it is. Glyphosate EPA has never undertaken risk assessment of glyphosate, which has, of course, for many years been one of the most used herbicides in New Zealand. So only reauthorization or amendments based on industry supplied data. Remember, they were added in 2006, but there's been no evidence of risk assessment. But of course, there's a history. Glyphosate has this history that makes it, inverted commas, controversial. In 2015, the IARC came out with a release and they said it probably causes cancer, and it definitely caused cancer in the laboratory animals. The IARC are the gold standard. They source through the open literature. They look broadly. They look at lots of different study types, toxicological, epidemiological. This caused a furore because glyphosate, the farmers need glyphosate for their applications. preceding applications or early stage applications for non-organic agriculture definitely has merit with glyphosate, but there is a big conversation that could be had around desiccation, the drying out of food crops using agri-chemicals, including glyphosate, and there is a big question mark around spraying glyphosate in urban and public spaces and spaces where the public are. And so they used private industry studies. So unlike the gold standard IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, they did not look at the open scientific literature. So in New Zealand, I was the co-author of a paper called Public Health Concern, Why Did the New Zealand EPA Ignore the World Authority on Cancer? So we went through, myself, now retired MP Stephen Browning, the history of glyphosate and looked at what was upholding the current evaluation for glyphosate and why the IARC's finding had merit. And this public health concern paper was supported by quite a lot of scientists, which if you search for this paper on the internet, you'll be able to see that. In 2018, a paper by Dowse et al., Carcinogenicity of Glyphosate, Why is the New Zealand's EPA Lost in the Weeds? That paper was released. Now, this paper was damning of this single toxicologist little review by the New Zealand EPA that discredited the IARC and then ignored the IARC finding from then on. These scientists were public health scientists, they were professors, they were hugely respected epidemiologists. And their paper was ignored by the EPA. Now, the EPA doesn't have a single... They don't have a scientist in the EPA of the same caliber as these scientists with the same level of expertise in cancer risk and human health. By 2020, glyphosate litigation had reached $10 billion, and the discovery process during this litigation revealed so much data that had been hidden or had been misleadingly interpreted. And so what we saw is findings for the applicants where they were awarded money for their different illnesses which occurred from often long-term spraying. So the litigation process unraveled these discovery documents. As well as that, the IARC looked at all this information. But for the New Zealand EPA in 2021, the subcommittee to assess whether there was significant new information had never met to discuss this new information. So it has no Act, Section 62. Now, the chief executive could have, like that, turned around and said, significant new information, let's pull together this subcommittee. Recognizing that subcommittee doesn't have the same expertise as the scientists that wrote the Why is New Zealand's EPA Lost in the Weeds. So they didn't actually have any of that experience. So this is I believe this is very shocking. It shows the EPA is unwilling to look at the non-technical data out there, including court cases, including the IARC finding. Now, this has been a technique of regulators throughout the world. They create their own little rules and guidelines, which often become out of date, and they refuse to look at court decisions that are really important. So instead, that in 2021, the New Zealand EPA, following the production of this methodology document that produced all the rules for everyone to see, that said, let's do call for information, they released a call for information of glyphosate, the first step to understanding how glyphosate is used. And it's a non-statutory process. It's not binding. It doesn't go into law. They're just reporting on public submissions. There's no scientific evaluation, no judgment, as I've said before. So as a result of no risk assessment, please let me know if I'm wrong, and maybe the Grow Safe manual, the secret Grow Safe manual that non-applicators can't look at because it costs lots of money, maybe that tells us, but as far as I'm aware, there's no DT50, there's no half-life for glyphosate in New Zealand conditions. So for example, in the far north with sandy or clay loam, there is no evidence for how long the half-life would be of glyphosate when it's sprayed on roadsides. So there's no tolerable exposure levels, there's no environmental exposure levels. When the EPA presented the summary report on glyphosate in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they ignored community health. The summary report did not summarise the science that was submitted. Dermal, inhalation, childhood, the evaluation of the scientific literature that many of us had submitted, that was ignored. So you on the PSGR's website, psgr.org.nz, you can search for our response to the call for information. So what they then said is EPA said next steps, once we finish the call for information, then we can see if there's grounds for reassessment. But many scientists in New Zealand believe there was grounds for reassessment in 2015 when the IARC decision was released. Then there were even more grounds for decision when the court cases rolled out the discovery information. Then the EPA say then they'll engage with Māori on the topic of glyphosate. But unfortunately, what we don't see is the evidence Māori are being shown on glyphosate's risk or harm. We're not seeing the fact that, I don't know whether the committee, the Māori that are consulted with, understand the implications of no science on mixtures, on the toxicity of ecosystems, on the fact that endocrine disruptors harm vertebrates just as they harm humans, which, for example, means that eels would be very vulnerable if, for example, there was endocrinological action. We don't know that. The science isn't being done. It's very surprising that science isn't being done in New Zealand to look at the risk to eels from agrochemical use and the agrochemical runoff in water surfaces. So let's be clear here that the New Zealand EPA, through the Has No Act, is granted power so as to protect the health and safety of the environment and people and communities. So they're meant to protect the health and safety. Yet we're seeing that the key scientists with the most knowledge of cancer and epidemiology were ignored and dismissed when the EPA has no relevant expertise in that area. We're not seeing the EPA splitting out risk scenarios. So, for example, we have the idea of killing weeds before you plant a crop or pasture. Then you have the idea of what would a spray on pastoral crops before stock was let run on and had that as stock feed. Then you've got the idea of desiccated crops that are food crops for humans that humans are then exposed to. Then you've got the residential and urban or roadside sprays. So years ago, the EPA could have broken apart these risk scenarios and looked at what was different. You've also got national transport, and you've got railway sprays along, around major assets and all that sort of thing. So the EPA could be doing this work. That means that the public in public places aren't exposed, but we can still have agriculture. But when those nuances aren't passed, you see important people that get to be published in newspapers talking about how we can't ban glyphosate, but we're not actually letting those nuances of, urban sprays or agriculture be separated and split apart. In 2022, Neil Pearce stated in his book, Pesticides and Health, the New Zealand EPA simply refuses to concede it could be carcinogenic at all. And he's a professor of epidemiology and biostatistics. He's the director of the Centre for Global Non-Communicable Disease at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So there's a lot of scientists in New Zealand that are a little bit sick of the EPA not looking at epidemiological and IARC data. But for councils are faced with the public walking into council chambers and laying out a lot of the science that's in the peer-reviewed literature that relates to the IARC finding, that relates to the new evidence. For example, that The formulation is more toxic. The formulation has heavy metals in it. When glyphosate's mixed with another active ingredient, it can become more toxic via additive toxicity or from synergies. But none of that is that when the council people look at that, they then are deferred by the staff in the back room back to the EPA. The EPA says it's safe and effective. But the problem is that we don't have scientists walking into council chambers in New Zealand today. And that is because of systemic failure by the machinery of government to put in places space for core funding for scientists to carry on long-term research, particularly about key chemicals that are undoubtedly released into the environment at very high levels. And glyphosate is one of those chemicals, particularly once the scientific literature starts to pull an image of harm together. So we know, and Professor Neil Pearce helps us with this, we know that human health research is not really supported by the Ministry of Health. So the Ministry of Health are responsible for monitoring human health, but they don't really do it. We've had 30 years of roadside spraying. We've had kids being sprayed. We've got vulnerable populations, including the elderly, those with autoimmune diseases, those with chronic illness, and those with spray sensitivity. But people who are sprayed or who are affected have no access to biomonitoring funds. It's easier to get your stock, your cow, tested for chemical exposures in New Zealand than it is to get a human person tested. So there's no scientists with core funding for long-term research through the Ministry of Health, who would, for example, fund the ESR to do that work. That's not done. Now, environmental health research is not supported by the Ministry for the Environment either. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has demonstrated that environmental monitoring is non-existent. Professor Eons Magellans from Wellington University has discussed in a 2018 paper how the EPA are also ignoring mixture effects, they're ignoring endocrine disrupting properties, and they're really failing to keep up with new knowledge on risk. And so the Ministry of Environment they oversee the New Zealand EPA. They could be putting all these processes in place, but they haven't. And the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has taken them to task for this. But as well as that, the ministries aren't funding the research. The universities and the Crown Research Institutes do not supply scientists with core funding for long-term research either. So New Zealand science is one big massive chasm of nothingness for environmental research. For example, the Brain Research Institutes don't look at the toxicity of environmental chemicals on neurodevelopmental delays or on, as far as I'm aware, on Parkinson's, for example. Or if they do, that sort of research will be short term, but there is no single spot where the public can go to understand what New Zealand's profile of risk is. So the New Zealand EPA doesn't do risk assessment, but it doesn't get a very important feedback loop from the science community. It doesn't require it, it doesn't demand it, and the Ministry for the Environment doesn't require that the EPA does that. I actually believe that scientists in EPA might be a little bit depressed because they know that they're cut off from doing a lot of meaningful, complex, interdisciplinary work. And other scientists are perfectly fine because they're happy with their very linear modelling type work that they do. So in this fact check, the New Zealand EPA has not undertaken risk assessment for glyphosate or metsulfuron methyl, nor the adjuvants mixed with it, such as, for example, pulse penetrant. They've ignored roadside risk from mixtures and to children. And the reauthorizations are based on applicant industry data, and the industry is not interested in the risk to child coming out of school where the pesticide was sprayed one day before, the child can't tell, bare feet, and for the next fortnight the child walks to school in bare feet because it's New Zealand, and that child is exposed every day to that exposure because the half-life is longer than normally expected. So we know that New Zealand EPA has ignored the dermal exposures, it's failed to convene the subcommittee, and it's never advocated for general government nor core funding. And as well as that, applicators are failed. WorkSafe looks at occupational health injury but has no funding or resources for chronic disease that arises out of exposures in the work environment. And Neil Pearce drew that attention to us as well. And then in Europe, the contradiction is that there's no authorization for roadside spraying in public spaces because it's all based on spraying onto cereals, onto crops, in orchards. And you can see from this, if you look closely, on the left is the metsulfuron methyl, and that's 2015 by the European Food Safety Authority, and on the right is glyphosate. We can see that there's no instructions to spray on roadsides in Europe. So if you take a look at glyphosate, which is of course the more toxic herbicide, the DT50, the time it takes for half of the active ingredient to break down is between 60 and 366 days. 43% of it breaks down in this time. And we've got AMPA, which is the metabolite that's more persistent and most likely what appears to be more toxic. And so you see, for example, clay loam, the DT50 is 67 days. And so, of course, and these studies are in agricultural environments because, again, we're not doing the studies in schoolyards or the studies in local parks. Apologies, this is aerobic in soil, so it's not wet environment where the residues would persist for longer, such as sediment. So what are councils to do? Because it seems to me they're overwhelmed by contradictions. The EPA says it's safe, glyphosate's safe to spray on roadsides. Metsulfuron methyl is safe to spray on roadsides. They're safe to spray if they're used according to the directions on the label. But the EPA is not doing risk assessment. It's not looking at what the European Food Safety Authority is finding in terms of persistence, and they're not really looking at groundwater risk. For example, the accumulation of metsulfuron methyl in groundwater. And the New Zealand EPA and local councils can recognise the power of the Has No Act to protect people and communities. Councils can take a precautionary approach, and they can actually value people and communities over council property, even in uncertainty. There is no risk assessment by the EPA. Councils are in a very awkward position. We know the call for information it's prevarication. It's putting off risk assessment that they could have done in 2016, 2017 or 2018. It's now 2023. There might not be a risk assessment following this call for information until maybe 2025. Likely, the EPA are waiting for findings overseas before they confirm to anything. And remember, the EPA is a weaker regulator. We don't have the stringent cancer specs as overseas, and we don't have as strong groundwater specs either. And remember, councillors, people, Europe doesn't approve of these chemicals for roadside or public use. And we can see from my earliest slides that herbicide resistance is a really big problem. The problem can't be plastered over by using more and more toxic sprays. And again, there's no evidence for the safety of the mixtures. That work is not being done. It could be being contracted to government universities. Our laboratory scientists could be doing that work, but there's no funding. And the policies aren't there to drive that. You know, the statement that, of course, it's safe once it's dry or according to the label carries no merit when there's no evidence being considered at the moment at how long the half-life is, how long the persistence is, as per those studies used, for example, in Europe. But what councillors can do, and councillors can do, which would be a very important first step to starting to change culture, is increasing transparency in the way contracts and subcontracts are granted. They could require all quotes for non-chemical maintenance to be available to elected members and staff and ensure there's no secret subcontracts. We've seen in Auckland the putting of one subcontract inside another, and everyone gets a cut. So by the time the quote arrives in council, it's expensive when the subcontractor that's actually doing the chemical-free work is quite actually affordable. And we could actually increase the flexibility. We could look at one more, cut a month over the growing season. Would that actually ensure safe vision on roadsides? Noting that New Zealand's NZ Waka Kotahi, their vegetation management requirements are very stringent and they're 20 years old, but I'm presuming they're based on a chemical regime, and we could compare what their minimums are, for example, with European minimums and what the Europeans think is, for example, safe and reasonable degree of vegetation on roadsides. Councillors could also look at really important explainers to residents. Why do parks no longer look like a neat film set? And explain that up until the invention of herbicides, parks always looked like that. Councillors could look more broadly. I consider that regional councils have a place to work with district councils to fund leasing for new forms of robotic and roadside cutting technologies. Machines can now mow around signposts. We could be thinking intelligently and cleverly. Dr. Charles Murfield down south has done this work. He can help inform councils on how to manage weed banks, how to reduce that work. And you've got the Weed Management Advisory Service in Auckland. We can take a precautionary approach. All persons shall, it's not could or might, shall take into account the need for caution in managing adverse effects where there is a scientific and technical uncertainty about those effects. And remember, the risk assessment methodology is not educating staff or applicants on how to take a precautionary approach. I think that has been a major failure of the NZ EPA for decades, actually. Or since 1996. And we need to start talking about what is morally unacceptable harm, because we often couch risk benefit as an economic benefit alongside a cultural. But when you think about the exposure of pregnant women, children, vulnerable people, whether they're vulnerable to sprays or they've got cancer, an immune disorder, morally unacceptable harm is a really important consideration. So it can be whether a chemical is threatening to human life or health, whether the impact will be serious or effectively irreversible, or inequitable to present or future generations, or it can be imposed without adequate consideration of the human rights of those affected. Because when ill people walk out of a doctor's surgery and the spray machine has gone past, or the children walk out of the school, I do not consider there has been adequate consideration of the rights of those people to choose or not choose to be exposed. They are being exposed. So I think that's all for today. I thank you for listening, and we wish you all the success in the world, helping to draw attention to the information gaps and the evidence on harm to elected members and to staff to help move away from sprays in urban environments where the public are easily exposed. Thank you very much.